change management is difficult. Getting people to change the way they operate is the most difficult process in any program implementing something from scratch.
There is a whole bunch of content in the enterprise that people shouldn't even know exists.
We're waiting for the industry to catch up to us.
You're talking about the empowerment of the individual over the empowerment of the establishment. It's my great pleasure to introduce today David McDermott, records management consultant and past president and chairman of ARMA International. Welcome, David. It's good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
All of us, in a sense, are records managers. I make content that requires records management perhaps every day. I know that you do as well in an organizations, practically every knowledge worker does, which wouldn't have happened if we talk about the olden days.
No, I tell my clients that our goal is to make records management part of everybody's DNA in their daily work process. How do they classify content? How do they file it? What's their file plans look like? What's the taxonomies look like? The challenge with that is employees don't have time to really spend a lot of thought process on how to do that. So employees tend to do what's easiest, right? I've seen employees name content with 250, 260 characters. And when you start getting a file path that's long, when you move that content into, let's say, a content management system, oftentimes those systems don't truncate that file path and making it very difficult to locate stuff. So I think employees do what's easiest because they have a job to do, and that job is not records management.
Part of Shinydocs' thesis certainly is that I use the word like fool's errands to try to get people to change the way they do work for the benefit of records management and retention. Is that perhaps the number one reason or a big reason why enterprise content management programs might fail, is if they truly think that they're going to change the minds of end users and get buy-in for the program?
I'll go back to years and years ago when I was a practitioner, senior manager, director level for organization I worked for, presenting the project to our CFO to implement content management in the email archive. And this woman, I leave her name out, but this woman said, "So what's the most difficult part?" And I said, "Well, buying software is easy." Yeah, not so much, but it's easy. Implementing software, easy. Change management is difficult. Getting people to change the way they operate is the most difficult process in any program implementing something from scratch, because these people have done this all their lives, right? They've put this stuff into a network share or a file share or a home drive or a C drive. And that's what they've become accustomed to. Some people even use Outlook as a repository for email without ever moving email that is a record out of that email system. And we know Outlook is not designed to be a content storage system. So people do what's easy. So change management, I believe, is one of the biggest issues organizations face as they try to implement these programs.
I also think one of the burdens that we've taken on is the fact that the ability to create content happens so much faster than our ability to manage it or understand it.
Now you're using one of my lines, and that's, of course, the ability to create content is outstripping our ability to manage it, right? And when your data footprint is growing at 20% a year, if not more, and the fact that we can get information anywhere, really at a flip of a finger, and then those people, they spend maybe 10 minutes looking for something and go, "Oh, it took me that long to find it. I'm just going to save it on my network share." And then 10 years later, it's still there. right? So we as humans, we operate off knowledge, right? Knowledge is power. And the more knowledge we have, the more power we have, we think. But when that knowledge gets buried in network shares and computer systems and not easily found, it gives you no power, right? So, but what it does do is it gives attorneys a lot of power during discovery, right? So, and we try not to use the stick method when we talk about implementing systems. We try to explain the value and the increased productivity and the reduced footprint of your data systems and your backup processes and all those things that go along with it that most organizations don't think about because it's so buried in their day-to-day operations for expenses.
Well, and that leads to a couple of follow-up questions. I'll start with the one on cost, is that there's often the words disk is cheap and these types of things are thrown out, but legal discovery across a petabyte of data is not cheap. Backup and retrieval and disaster recovery is not cheap.
Not cheap.
So I of course we've done the math on this together in projects before where the actual cost of the spinning disk or the SSD these days is just a trivial factor on top of all the additional non-obvious costs associated with that content. And I would suggest that legal discovery blows all of them out of the water. So you better be prepared for that when it's going to come. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I testified on the 2006 amended rules of the Federal Civil Procedure, rules of civil procedure for the U.S. government. And I followed the storage network folks when I had that testimony. And they testified that storage is cheap and there should be no reason to ever delete content because it's so inexpensive. You think about today, I mean, I can get an external drive with 2 terabyte on it for $58
or 50
yeah, $90, whatever.
Yep, exactly.
Are you talking Canadian or US dollars? Right?
No. I must be Canadian. Yeah, we got tariffs, don't you know?
So yeah, storage is cheap.
Yeah.
But it's all that back end process that it's not cheap. And part of the rules that came out is the fact that it's very difficult to force a company into producing content out of their backup tapes or being able to do discovery if they've got systems in place to manage their content. That came out of that testimony. The safe harbor rule came out of that testimony. In other words, if organizations have a system in place to manage their content and can prove chain of custody and audit trail process, then it should be much, much more difficult for a plaintiff to force a defendant into going to backup tapes and doing forensics, right? So when you think about the cost of doing forensics on electronic data, the numbers, don't set me in concrete on these anymore because I'm not positive of them, but they used to be anywhere from like $5,000 to $18,000 a gig to do forensics. So if you've got a large organization and all of a sudden you have to produce 10 terabyte of content that they need to go through forensics on, start doing the math. And take it a step further, when we think about data analytics and discovering what we have in our systems, if you're doing it in a process that is ad hoc, you're never going to know, right? The only time you really find out is if you get into that big litigation and you have to go through a huge discovery process. Then you're going to find the stuff you don't want to find. And believe me, we have found stuff where the companies, I worked for an organization many, many, many years ago. They just said, how much do you want? Right? You find those smoking guns, and employees don't do it nefariously. They don't typically do stuff that is going to get the company in trouble. But attorneys are very, very good at twisting a document and making it look like it was bad. And employees don't keep that stuff to get the company in trouble. And then they keep it, and then they forget it's there. And then it's found through discovery. I would rather find that content in a cleanup discovery process where you eliminate that content according to your policies before you ever get into litigation, right? I don't think organizations have a clue about the content they have sitting out on their networks or on their home drives or their desktops. I've always been in the camp that a single source of truth is the best, but I don't believe in my wildest dreams that you can have a single source of truth in today's environment.
I agree, David. The joke I kind of throw around right now is that if I was to put David McDermott in charge of fisheries in the United States, and then you said to me, that's great, I'll take on this burden. Now put all the fish in this lake beside me so that I can study them.
Yeah, then I'd be fishing all day.
I know, it'd be fantastic. I've seen some of your good work in that arena. But it's obviously, we're not going to do that. We need to study the ecosystems where they are and just make sure that we're managing them to the best of our ability where they are. And I believe the ecosystems associated with content management is the same thing. So you've got edge points that have Internet of Things that are generating information like the torque values on screws as something rolls off an assembly line. On the other side, you've got, so that's distributed, that's out there somewhere in a factory. That's not going to go, maybe it'll find its way into records management practice, but it's out there for the time being. You got work orders, you've got all this stuff that's happening everywhere. And the idea of saying, oh, you don't need it over there anymore. We're going to grab it all and plop it here for our benefit, and you need to come and find it here. It's really difficult to say to a whole business, especially when you get across thousands of users.
I include the ecosystem, I include the employees in that, right? When you disrupt employees, that's when they get angry. And you're missing something there too, Jason. It's not only the electronic data, but you've got this mountain of content sitting out in supplier storages such as Iron Mountain, Access, all those really good vendors that manage that hard copy. But when you start looking at the way employees put content, physical content into those repositories such as Iron Mountain or Access, they're not very well listed. They're not indexed. They're not classified. Most people think that their content they create or receive in order to do their jobs is the most critical, vital content the company has. And they can't even fathom, not everybody, but the hoarders, the small handful of people, they can't even fathom, and how dare you even think about delete my content? And so this is a question more for you, Jason. What happens with all this unstructured content that is really, really old, and you want to migrate it into a new system? What do you do with those corrupted files that are out there that people don't even know are corrupted? And what do you do with that? How do you manage that?
It is an eternal question, and like a good lawyerly answer, it depends. But certainly there are options of quarantining the content, putting a life cycle on it, saying, okay, well, what's our minimum retention policy? Well, it might be 7 years on unclassified data. So you start the clock on that, and you put discovery search on top of it to the best of your ability. Maybe if it's corrupt content, maybe it's file path only. And then you take the files one by one as you might need the information out of it. And otherwise, you just let it fall off, because reducto ad absurdum to say a million years from now, none of us are going to care about any of the documents we just created. I don't think any of them will matter, except for maybe the great works of George Lucas or something like that. But other than that, it's these things can fall off. IT that we've talked about, I think fairly respectfully so far, And records management, who has been prioritized in our conversation, do think differently. Like record management plays an infinite game. The whole idea in an infinite game is to keep playing. Whereas a finite game like baseball, you 27 outs and you're done the game.
Right.
9 innings, you're done the game. And that's more the way IT tends to think. We're doing the cleanup project. Whereas records management they can't align with that in good conscience. Say, I'm not doing a cleanup project. I have to put a cleanup program in place that continues to run forever. Otherwise, our discovery costs and all of the affiliate costs associated with storage and the actual physical storage costs themselves are going to run out of control. Do organizations spend enough time choosing their leadership that understands the difference between the infinite game of records management and the finite game of information technology programs?
Well, that's a great question. I think some do, some don't. I think records management and IT is working much better together today than they ever have. Back 20 years ago, IT and records management was this. You know, you've heard me say IT's the tools, RM's the rules. The problem with that is IT would look at those rules and go, they're too difficult. We can't implement them. You have 300 retention periods. You have 1,800 record categories. We can't implement that. So IT and records management over the years have started getting into the sandbox together more and more. And if you're going to be successful, they need to do that. I think the IT folks today are recognizing more and more that we need to work together to accomplish the end goal, right? And I think that's critical for success. The one term you didn't use, you know, in records management, we get all wigged out and get wrapped around the axle on people deleting content without following a process. We want to be defensible. We always use the term defensibility, right? We create retention periods that allow people to do what they want with their content. If it's especially like daily operation type records, things that aren't really a record, but we want to be able to manage it because we don't want it left in our network shares for years and years. So we give some flexibility to employees to manage and delete their own content based on those rules. But we want to be able to go into a deposition and defend our content management processes in a litigation or a regulatory action. So that's why we try to set these consistent rules in place to do that.
It's one of those things where you kind of have to experience death to appreciate life. You got to get your butt kicked a little bit, and then you realize, oh, I should have been doing this other thing all along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you think about it, it's sad, right? We need information to keep the wheels turning on our business, right? We need information. But at what point does that information become a liability and not an asset? And how do you set the processes in place to consistently manage that and to delete it, especially when you've got employees that may not agree with your retention periods and say things like, I don't buy into your processes. I'm just taking my stuff home, right? It's not your stuff.
And the good news is, though, there is some standardization. There is some practices that help with this. And there are some modernization tools, like obviously self-serving. We've been quite successful with our customers in that. Maybe we can tie it all up with some upbeat. It's about things that people are doing really well right now.
Absolutely. You know, I've worked now as a practitioner. I've implemented a couple solutions. And again, I'm agnostic to the solutions. I hope you understand. But we've implemented applications to do cleanup. Customers that I've worked with as a consultant have been very supportive of doing this analysis and discovery process. and we've actually got people buying in on cleaning up their content. It's like, oh my gosh, you mean I don't have to go back 15 years ago and figure out what I need and what I don't need? You're going to do it for me? Absolutely, right? So we're seeing some very nice success stories. We're seeing success in cleaning up, in some cases, millions of files that people no longer need or didn't even know were sitting out in a network share that might have been orphaned. And in content management, it's kind of a marriage, right? We tend to sensationalize the bad stuff, but we don't sensationalize the good stuff. And there is a lot of good stuff going on.
I do like that, David, because it kind of ties back to the infinite game we were talking about. Marriage is a classic example of the infinite game. You're not trying to win your marriage. Well, maybe you're trying to win your marriage, but you know what I mean?
I did.
You can't win your marriage. You can only play. And there's always areas for improvement, but there's always great things that are happening in there. And the way to win is just to stay in the game. So I appreciate
absolutely. You know, I tend to lean more toward the bad stuff because I've sat through too many depositions in life, trying to defend what an organization did. But when you look at some of the things going on, not just with my clients, but with other organizations, I have lots and lots of colleagues that are doing this. And we're seeing some real success stories. The challenge is, do you do it manually? God help us. Or do you get a good analytics AI tool that is going to help you through the journey, right? And then I always tell people, it's not magic. It's not technical magic. There's some heavy lift that has to occur. And if you're willing to do that, the success at the end of the rainbow is going to be great, right? So that's how we have to concentrate.
It's nice to take time to celebrate the wins,
Absolutely.
but it's part of our DNA to dig deep into the opportunities and see what can be done about that.
At the end of the day, you got to have the right people running the tools, and you got to have the right support to do what you need to do to clean this content up.
In a sense, we're coming at it right now where people have had a couple of years of AI success and failure to get a reality check on it. And there was some thought 4 or 5 years ago that this was going to just take over everybody's jobs and fix everything. And the computers aren't going to be smarter than the people operating them. All it is going to amplify the ability of the people operating massively. And if they could on their own delete 1,000 files in a week, they can probably find that same type of file across millions of files over the course of that week.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, being able to understand attributes and trying to understand how people think, and that's the value of this analytics, you know, AI, is all of a sudden you can start looking and digging deeper and start discovering different ways people name stuff, and it's the same document. I think any organization that's trying to do something manually is a fool's errand.
Well, thank you, David. This has been David McDermott, records management consultant, past president and chairman of ARMA International. And I really appreciate you taking the time today, David. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. And again, I don't mean to come off negative, because there's a lot of great success stories out there. And I do believe organizations are looking at this now and recognizing that there's opportunity to manage their content in a more consistent, normal course of business way.